everybody, and welcome to the Duckpin Podcast. I am your host, Brian Griffiths. Welcome to the show. We've got a lot of great guests lined up here in the first few weeks. We are kicking off today with Andy Smarick talking about education in the time of COVID. Don't miss it this week on the inaugural episode of the Duckpin Podcast. Our guest on this week's episode of the Duckpin Podcast, somebody I've known for a very long time, one of the leading experts amongst conservatives when it comes to public education. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He is a former president of the Maryland State Board of Education, a former deputy commissioner of education in New Jersey, currently a member of the Maryland Higher Education Commission, and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, my good friend, Andy Smarick. Andy, it's a pleasure to have you on this inaugural episode.
Well, it's a treat, Brian. Thank you so much for having me. Congratulations on launching this thing. Very exciting. It's going to be fun to talk. And I should say, the disclosure or the disclaimer at the beginning, everything I say is my opinion and my opinion alone. They do not reflect the administration, the Maryland Higher Education Commission, even though I was fortunate enough to be appointed and confirmed for that great role.
A disclaimer you very clearly have a lot of familiarity with in these time periods. Well, obviously, the first thing on top of everybody's mind, school starts next week. School starts right the day after Labor Day, and for the first time, we are starting the school year with virtual schooling. Obviously, during your time as president of the State Board of Education, this is not something that you had to deal with as it relates to virtual education. As somebody who sat on the board, as somebody who is very well versed in public education, just share your thoughts a little bit about the virtual education regime and how virtual education is going to impact our students and our schools this year.
It's a gigantic question. So I'll begin sort of at the beginning, and then you can tell me where you want to dive in. The best way to think about this is virtual education has been around for quite some time. A number of states have had pretty robust programs, including Florida, and there are lots and lots of students, especially at the secondary level in high school, who've been taking online courses. So it's not entirely new, and more states have some experience than Maryland has had. Some schools have done it outside of Maryland for quite some time and done it pretty well. There's some research on it. We can get into that if you want. Higher performing students have a tendency to do better online than lower performing students. The older students have a tendency to do better. So there's that body of information. My point here is this is not totally new for America. It's newer for Maryland because we just haven't had a very big program. What's new is that we, like a light switch, we turned it on and decided that we needed it to go to scale in March. And now, to your point, we're not it's not spring training anymore. Like now the year's beginning and everyone has to be ready for this. Virtually all of the students in the state who are in public schools are going to be doing some kind of online learning, at least for some period of time. So the big story here is, are we able to ramp this up to take it to scale to have our nearly 1 million students do it and have the thousands of teachers do it and do it well? And then there are all of these kind of wonky questions. How do you handle school lunches, school breakfast? How do you handle attendance? How do you handle assignments and grading? How are we going to handle the statewide mandatory testing and accountability systems? So the wonk inside of me says there are all these technical things that we have to worry about, but the most important thing is lots of school administrators and principals will tell you one of the most stressful times of year in normal times is the beginning of school. It's actually really hard, like on the first day, to have buses and like all the transportation issues and all of the staffing issues and all of the scheduling issues taken care of. Now multiply that by 100, and that's what the first day of school with online is going to look like. Complicated. So get ready for some choppy waters.
Yeah, I know that, just speaking in our experience here, my wife's a teacher, and it was very late in the process where they even got a schedule out, or we're just sharing information. And I sympathize to an extent with all the administrators. They have a very tough position that they have been put in. Let's talk about some of the research that you talked about, particularly as it relates to high-performing students versus low-performing students. One of the things that kind of piqued my interest, and this is kind of a Maryland-focused thing here, is that one of our constitutional requirements, as you know, is to provide a robust system of public education. It seems to me that, obviously we have issues, particularly here in Maryland, as it relates to, the differences in student performance based on, a number of socioeconomic factors. It sounds like what you're telling me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that some of those socioeconomic issues are going to be exacerbated by going to online learning. Is that true?
It's possible. So let me just give you a pat on the back and start where you began, which is you're right. Maryland, and interestingly, every single state has a constitutional provision that requires the state government to make sure that there's a system of public education. Most of these state constitutional provisions do not say that the state has to be the one to provide the education or get into the details of what the education looks like. Now, as a matter of tradition and history and some logic, all states other than Hawaii, which is like an outlier case, have multiple school districts. You delegate the responsibility that sits at the state level. You delegate the operation to a bunch of school districts. Maryland has 24 of them, but there are other states that have 500, 600, 700 of them. And then the state makes sure education gets done, but then allows others to do it. Given that, in almost all states, there's a recognition that online learning and certainly private schooling, but also homeschooling, microschooling, all of these options are potentials, but then you have to decide actually how you work them out. And so this question of online learning and what the data tells us is, and we don't have enough experience, certainly in Maryland, to shake all of this out quite yet, is that it's harder for lower performing students to do well on this. Often if they have more basic skills and a harder time staying on task for a long period of time, it is hard to sit in front of a screen for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours and achieve, as opposed to a student who's already thriving in school and has a bunch of background information and can self-regulate really well. Now, I should say some students thrive with online learning. Not everyone does, though. And to your point of like the achievement gap, I don't want to be too much of a Eeyore here and like have a rain cloud, but it would not be unreasonable for people to believe or expect that the achievement gaps that we've had could expand both in terms of income and race. At least the first signs of this are it could be the case that higher performing and white students end up doing better, and progressively over time, lower income students do less well. And so this achievement gap grows, and that will have all sorts of implications for our test results come spring and high school graduation rates and interventions in schools and everything else. So again, the complications of this are serious.
One of the other issues with the socioeconomic gap between haves and have-nots, for lack of a better term, in Maryland is the technology gap. And I know that's something that a lot of schools are addressing. But when you have wealthy jurisdictions, wealthier families, upper class, middle class families, already have the technology, the computers, the Wi-Fi connectivity, that sort of stuff. And I know that in a lot of urban schools, a lot of Title I schools, no matter where they are in Maryland, there is a significant gap there insofar as having access to technology, access to the Wi-Fi systems. Obviously, a lot of places are now using grants, whether they're state grants or federal grants, to get Chromebooks, for example, in the hands of students and teachers. But at some point, some of that they're going to have to take out of Hyde. From your experience, knowing your familiarity with school budgets, how much does that hurt a school district to have to kind of reprogram that money on the fly? I mean, I think people understand, these budgetary processes are 4 or 5 years in advance. And now all of a sudden you have to reprogram that money to go from this AA thing that you were going to do to this technology thing that you now have to do. What do you think? I know there's a lot in there right there. So I guess first and foremost, how do we help those who with the technology gap overcome that technology gap? And what's the long-term impact of the budgetary restraints that these schools are going to have thanks to having to move this money around?
those are all good questions. So let me tackle a piece of this first, because I think it might be ultimately the most interesting and the thing that has the biggest influence on our thinking down the line, especially if online learning continues for not just weeks, but months, which is, let's give the benefit of the doubt to schools and districts. A lot of us are going to be frustrated who have kids, and we were expecting a certain type of education, and it's going to look different. But I just want to give people a sense of just how difficult this is. Imagine there's a company that for 150 years has produced cars, and they have figured out everything from how to get the rubber to how to get the steel to how to get staff there on time, how to do production lines, how to do work with all their different subcontractors. And they build up all these systems over 150 years, and they're really good at building cars. And then something happens and someone tells them, yeah, next week, we're going to need you to start to build refrigerators instead. They could say, well, okay, we know a little something about production and we know a little something about getting inventory, but you told us to do A for 150 years, now B. We would expect there to be all sorts of hangups, all types of trouble. So think about this in terms of schools. They have, in many places, these school systems, which got started in the middle of the 19th century, have figured out bus routes, and they have figured out facilities, and they figured out how many kids can be in a classroom, and they figured out fire drills, and they figured out textbooks and testing and accountability, all these things. And then suddenly the pandemic hits, and we say, yeah, 50% of the things that you used to take for granted, we have to throw those out the window. And now you have to think immediately of how to solve all these other problems. Things like, what about kids whose only meals they get through school? They can't come to school anymore, but you still have an obligation to get them a meal. We used to assume that 25 kids would be in a classroom and a teacher would be delivering instruction. They're not going to be in your classroom anymore. Figure out how they have a device and internet capacity. We used to be able to hand out material in paper form and grade it and have a way of entering the data. Yeah, that's not going to be the case anymore. We're going to have to use some sort of data system that captures all this information. And then the difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning, like the technical challenges here are absolutely gigantic. And so schools and districts, even the best of them, have to figure out, how do we repurpose money that may have gone from bus drivers to buying Chromebooks? Well, there could be limitations based on a state budget or a local budget on whether or not they could do that. Or there could be a question of, we can give them Chromebooks, but there isn't wireless capacity in certain neighborhoods, or it's going to be too slow. I mean, I could go on and on and on with all these complications. But the truth of the matter is, schools can do their best to move money around, and they're going to try to do it. And the last piece of this puzzle that people have to be super aware of is the economy obviously tanked in the last quarter, and it will probably look bad in this quarter. So that means tax revenue at the federal level and at the state level are going to be lower. Local level may be less affected if it's driven by property taxes, but still to be determined. But if about 40 or 50% of most schools' budgets come from the state, and the state has way less money than it used to, they just don't have very much money. So come the middle of this year or next year, when they have to buy new computers or do something new on curriculum, there's just not going to be a whole lot of money to walk around with to solve these kinds of problems. So on top of the technical difficulties, we're about to run headlong into these financial difficulties as well. I would not want to be, or let's just say, let's have a whole lot of sympathy for a district superintendent right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Once they buy all this technology, now there, of course, there becomes the added issues of, you have to track the technology, you have to track all these assets and do all this other stuff. Then when you go back to school eventually, which is going to happen at some point, there's a reliance on this technology, at least during this first part of the year, which however long it is while the students are at home. And now that's become an integral part of the school year. Do you see in a situation where it's going to be a difficult transition going back to away from this Chromebook based, this computer based learning, when teachers and students, I mean, it's going to affect both teachers and students, go back to the classroom, whenever that is?
Good question. And I have a prediction on this, but I'm going to underline prediction 2 or 3 times because no one knows the answer to this, and I could turn out to be wrong. And this is part of my just fundamental conservatism that is going to come out here. So I believe, even though there are lots of people who say America's public education system is, stuck in the industrial era and it hasn't been updated and all that kind of stuff, I actually believe that America's system of public education is evolutionarily robust, that we have to change some things related to accountability and choice and so on. But what we've landed on after 150 years of trying this stuff is wise. It's been time tested. So everything from residentially based schools to the size of classrooms to the training of teachers and all this stuff makes sense for reasons that are visible and invisible. So some people would say, no, we do what we do right now just out of laziness and habit. The conservative in me would actually say, no, it's actually proven itself to be evolutionarily robust. We're doing it because it makes sense and it has served all these kinds of manifest and latent needs. So that's the background on this. So what you've raised is this question of, okay, what if it's the case that people, teachers and students and families get acclimated to their Chromebooks and online learning? Does that fundamentally alter everything going forward? My prediction is no, it's not going to. That is, I think there's enough evidence that we have out there that online learning can be a good supplement, but it is not going to be a replacement system for a whole lot of students. It turns out that kids and adults engaged in the interpersonal stuff of learning, transmitting norms and traditions, and giving a kid a hug when necessary, being a little bit tough when necessary, having a kid acculturated to a classroom and other adults. All those things are invaluable, and it's hard to measure them, but it's part of our education system. So I don't think that we are I don't believe that just because people are going to be doing online learning for a certain period of time, that that's going to erase all of the good things that we've learned from the traditional system. Now, we may ultimately see an uptick permanently in the number of high school students who take courses online, or we might realize something like some teachers like doing tutoring online, or some students benefit from getting supplemental services online. Some of these micro changes are absolutely likely, but a wholesale fundamental shift, I think, is unlikely. So I would bet, let's hope that there's a vaccine by early next year, and people start to feel much more comfortable sending their kids back, and schools can get back to normal either at the end of this school year or the next one. I would bet that public schooling looks a whole lot more like it did in February of this year prior to the pandemic than it does right now when we're fully online.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people, both teachers and students and parents alike, who would love to see us back in the February timeframe. One of the reasons for that, particularly from the parents' perspective, is screen time. I know there have been a lot of activists who have been pushing the schools to reduce the amount of screen time that is, before any of this happened. Now we're creating a situation where at minimum 4 hours a day in front of screens actively learning, and that doesn't even count anything, any outside work or homework that they may have to do as well. Has this issue come up kind of in your research or kind of in your tenure on the State Board of Education here in Maryland? And just kind of what are your general thoughts about parental concerns with screen time?
Yeah, it's funny because there was this time, maybe a decade or 8 years ago, where the concept of online learning, and you'll probably remember at the higher education level, there are these things called MOOCs that became very hot, and everyone was talking about Khan Academy, this online delivery system of content. And so many people got captured by the potential of digital learning, online learning. And there were some school boards and some district superintendents who actually would pat themselves on the back that they were going 100% tablet or 100% Chromebook or 100% whatever else. And they were going to increase the amount of time that students were on task, actually on screens. And it seemed like the excitement got ahead of parents' desires and certainly got ahead of the research. And then suddenly, as more and more families got experience with students being on their devices, not just an hour a day, but 2 or 4, 6 hours a day, and then also, having an iPhone, there were these concerns about what does it do to brain development and anxiety and all these other kind of mental health questions. So then there was this pulling back of raising these questions of maybe did we get too excited about this too fast? And so when I was on the state board, there were these concerns about like the health aspects of too much screen time. But at the same time, Maryland was far behind other states on our district's ability to experiment with online learning. So there were these two things going on at the same time, pulling in different directions. On the one hand, the policy side, are we open enough to allow experimentation? The general answer was no. And some of us were trying to push the state policy to enable more experimentation. But at the same time, this lingering question of people saying, maybe the fact that we've done education for a long time in person and tried to keep kids off screens, maybe that's the way we should keep it. And maybe this fevered attempt to do more digital stuff actually isn't in the best interest of kids. And so now we have no choice. Kids are going to be in front of their screens a whole lot for the next at least couple months. Let's hope we're able to navigate this.
Let's talk about that for a second. You talk about at least a couple of months, because there's been, we have seen some schools have opened and then have closed again. We have seen some schools are going hybrid. Some schools are going full virtual. In Maryland recently, the governor announced that the schools Governor Hogan announced that the schools could reopen safely for jurisdictions that had submitted a plan. Now, obviously, having so many things different going on, not just within, from state to state, but within states too.
Yep.
What kind of disruption do you think that has, both on planning purposes, on teachers, on students even, because there's so much indecision, disruption, and potential change? I mean, we're talking about saying the first quarter of the school year, kids are going to be at home 100% and then returning to a at least hybrid environment. How disruptive is that going to be to the actual educational process?
Probably significant. And there were some people who 6 months ago were predicting that if it were the case that schools couldn't open back up in September, that open up full time, that the primary delivery system was going to be hybrid, that there was going to be some online and some in person. But what actually we've seen more of across America is one or the other, fully online, or we're going to try to go back full time. And part of the reason why is, go back to my example earlier of the company that either builds cars or refrigerators. If you're going to tell a company, stop building cars, they would rather say, fine, let us readjust and change everything we have to do so we can do refrigerators. Don't ask us to do both at the same time. That's an entirely different thing. So that's one of the reasons why we have seen less hybrid. If you're going to tell a school in a district to do online learning, they got to figure out how to do online learning. If you're going to try to have them be fully in person, allow them to figure out how to do that, desks far enough apart and enough sanitizer, and figure out bus routes, and making sure teachers are safe and all those kinds of things. So school systems are just trying to figure out how in the world do they make this work for the time being. And the more we have federal policy or state policy that is changing what they're doing, the more difficult it's going to be. But maybe even more challenging than that is if there are these mixed signals or changing signals saying, oh, you should be full-time online for 3 months. And then we come back and say, no, you should be full-time online for 6 weeks. People in any domain of professional life know that they have to reorient personnel and funding and all these things to get a certain job done. And I think a lot of families and the people running these schools need certainty. And another part of my conservatism that will come out is Maryland is a relatively small state in terms of landmass, but it's diverse and has 24 school systems. And what is going on with the virus in Garrett County or Washington County, in the far west part of the state, may be very different than Baltimore City or Montgomery County, and that may be very different than Talbot County or Somerset County. So one thing that Governor Hogan deserves a whole lot of credit for, and I should put in parentheses, I don't know that any state generally that's done as well as Maryland on a bunch of different vectors on this issue, generally like testing and the safety of students and opening workplaces. Maryland's done quite well. One thing he deserves credit for is the sense of decentralized decision-making, that there shouldn't just be a statewide policy that Garrett County and Baltimore City and Somerset County all have the exact same policy. We're going to have some state standards and then allow these school leaders to make these decisions as best as they can, because they are getting pressure from their teachers union, from their parents, from their students on the right way to do this. And they're trying to figure all this out. So if they're hearing one thing from their school board, and their parents, and a different thing from the governor, and a different thing from the Secretary of Education, and a different thing from the CDC, that's a problem. So the more continuity, the more clarity we can get, then we can have these professionals figure out the best way to do it. So the more we can do to minimize disruptions, I think the best for everybody involved.
Let's talk about that. You mentioned the unions for a second, and I keep hearing, and it's all anecdotal evidence. I keep hearing that there's a lot of teachers who actually wanted to go back this year. They wanted to be back in the classroom, but it was the unions, particularly here in Maryland, the MSEA, that kept pushing the issue of virtual learning over in-person learning. How much influence do you think the union's persistence on virtual learning played into the decisions of local boards, the decisions of local governments, and ultimately the governor's decision to allow schools eventually to reopen again?
They played some role, and there's a narrative out there, especially in some conservative circles, that the reason why schools aren't open is just because the unions were trying to sabotage this. And I think that as a general rule, that's an unfair criticism for two reasons. One is often it was the case, according to all of the national surveys that have been done, and there are many of them, somewhere between 2/3 and often 3/4 of parents continue to have lingering concerns about sending their kids back to school full time. So it could have been the case that we opened every single school in America for full-time in-person education, and 3/4 of families said, I just don't feel comfortable with that. So it's not just like a political decision that these schools weren't open. There were very real concerns from families. The other part is it is the union's duty, like it is their responsibility by contract, by law, by if they're a nonprofit organization, by their nonprofit status. They got to look out for their members, and the health and safety of their members is important. And we know that kids may be less susceptible to the virus and not get sick and may be less likely to pass it on. But if you have a school system or a particular school where, let's just imagine 50% of your teachers are 55 years of age or older, it absolutely is the responsibility of the union to raise that as a concern, saying, at minimum, let's be slow about this and make sure that the adults who we're supposed to be looking out for are taken care of and that we're not putting them at risk. So, yes, obviously politics is always going to play into this stuff, but let's just make sure that we recognize that a bunch of grownups had to look out for themselves, but also look out for kids. And I think in lots of cases, what we're going to see is like a gradual going back to school, families feeling more comfortable, teachers feeling more comfortable. People are hot about it right now because it's throwing off everybody's schedule, but I don't see too many villains in this yet. That's like the easy narrative, and I think I've seen a lot of good behavior from people.
Yeah, I think that's kind of been the message that conservatives seem to have, fellow conservatives have not always gotten, is the fact that a lot of teachers are, like you said, they are either 55 or older or 50 or older, and they're more experienced teachers. And not just are they more experienced teachers, they could have spouses who are high risk. They could have children who are high risk. The parents of a lot of these kids are high risk. I understand the literature about the kids being, not as susceptible to the virus as adults are. But I mean, clearly there is a broader picture here, not just for the children, but for the societal health, for the health of the workers and the health of the parents too. And I think a lot of our fellow conservatives seem to have got that message lost somewhere.
I think that's right. But let me add one thing to this that I think is going to be provocative on the other side, but I think it's a legitimate debate to have, which is if there are places where kids are not getting a full 6 hours worth of education, they're just getting a couple packets and maybe, 90 minutes worth of content, it is completely legitimate for families to say, my property taxes haven't gone down, my state taxes haven't gone down. Essentially, I am paying for these services that I am not getting. So we need to have a conversation about whether or not families can get rebates, taxpayers should get rebates if schools are not doing as much. Or at minimum, we should be having conversations about let's make sure that all the money that is that our tax dollars that are being allocated to schooling is actually being used as well as possible so kids get the services that they need. If it's the case that a school system thinks that they can provide minimum education and still get all of the money that they had in the past, that just isn't just. Now, that's sort of a hypothetical concern, but it's something that we ought to at least have in mind. but it at least gets us thinking along these lines. Public education is something that we're paying for, and for the best interest of society and for the best interest of kids. And adults should do their best to make sure kids are getting everything that they need. And we should continue to put pressure and say, yeah, we know that this challenge of going online is hard, but that doesn't mean that we can just set a 5-year-old in front of a screen for 6 hours a day and call that schooling. If it's going to cost less to do what school systems are planning to do, well, let's figure out how people can get their money back, or that we cut the budgets in the future. But let's at least have this as a conversation that if online learning continues, the budgets are going to look different.
Let's talk about the rebate issue for a second, because a lot of conservatives were pushing the idea of everybody getting their X number of dollars per pupil back, and creating these pods and all this other stuff. And I pushed back against that, just because I think a lot of conservatives don't see, some of the other budgetary necessities that are there. Yes, 81%, I'm using Anne Arundel County here as an example, 81% of our budget goes to salary and benefits, but there's still 19% of the budget that has to cover curriculum, physical plant, maintenance, and all of that other stuff. And it also doesn't take into account curriculum, because the idea was, okay, we're going to pay $150,000 a year to one teacher to teach this pod. Well, it's like, okay, where are they going to meet? What's the curriculum going to be? Are they going to buy the curriculum legally? What technology are they going to have in place? So I know I pushed back about that. I want to get your thoughts on that, and whether or not there's been any research into how a pod would work, or if a pod could even be effective.
Great question. So pods are brand new. They're called pandemic pods often, so we don't know too much about them yet. What we do know something about is they are in this just called like the genus or the species of homeschooling, which, and just for your listeners who may not have kept up with all of these like technical matters, is the theory here is people started saying, all right, I, a parent, and my spouse, we got to work. We have these kids who are in school. We have to work. If it's going to be online schooling, we need to figure something out. This just isn't going to work. And if our school isn't going to be open, how do we navigate this thing? So organically, and this is, something that Hayek or Tocqueville would have loved, without any state direction, a bunch of families in a bunch of different places self-organized to say, all right, our school isn't open. We're not sure that this online delivery is going to be best. Let's self-organize into small groups, maybe 5 families, maybe 10 families, maybe 5 kids, 10, 15 kids, and we'll kind of create our own mini classroom, mini school. And then we as parents will either take turns teaching them, or we'll hire a tutor or a teacher to come in and teach them. And we'll sort of be a self-contained unit, hopefully safe, and the kids can get their instruction. So this is happening even without any government control whatsoever. Then the question became, well, if schools aren't providing as much content, therefore they need less money, right? So doesn't that mean if families are going to take on this responsibility that they should either get a stipend or some sort of rebate, or some people were pushing for essentially what's called the education savings account, where we just completely voucherize all the money that would have gone to the school system, give it directly to families, and then they can figure out tutoring or pods or a homeschooling or some other kind of professional online learning. Like all of these different like spontaneous things could have erupted from this. And we saw news stories all across the country where families were doing this, and the school system then started sending out letters or emails saying, hey, families, please don't do this. Because the school system was worried about kids not coming back, that would have an effect on their budgets. And then these equity concerns, if it's only more affluent families that can do pods, what does that mean for the achievement gap and so on? So we're working our way through this right now. So in general, most places, the budgets for schools have stayed the same. Most of the pod stuff is happening organically and privately funded. And we don't know how many kids are taking part in this. We don't know totally about the demographics of it yet. And we don't know how effective it is going to be, whether or not high-performing students are going to do great, lower-performing students are going to do poorly, or vice versa. Maybe having a small classroom with a single teacher will benefit lower-performing students more. We just don't know. But Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, and others have been pushing hard on this idea of, over a long period of time, let's have money follow the child. Rather than money going to a school system, let's have money go to families. Families can make choices. And this would just be a hyper-accelerated version of that. The proposals are out there. They haven't gotten too much traction yet, but the idea is if families are going to do the education, let's make sure they get the money that would have gone to the school so they can figure it out. We're at like the first 100 yards of a marathon on learning of how this is going to work. Too soon to tell, but it's a neat example of like Americans being like, can do, let's figure this out. Okay, the government can't figure out the school stuff. We're going to do it ourselves. And then we have to see if it works or not.
Well, naturally, that leads right into the debate about vouchers, school choice, charter schools, just the general school choice discussion topic, which often seems, usually not always, seems to break down into the left-right discourse that we all seem to get pigeonholed on everything these days. In my opinion, just based on, hearing people, talking to people, it seems like there's probably a little more support for school choice now than there was 6 months ago based on discussion of pods. Schools that are going to open, private schools that are going to open as opposed to public schools. What's your kind of take on that? And, is this going to move the ball forward in the much needed debate in support of school choice?
Well, let me reveal my priors on this so people can either like agree with me or apply a discount to what I'm going to say. Let me explain like my philosophical position on this because I'm not like a disinterested observer on this. So I believe that there are great virtues in traditional public education. I love the idea of small communities coming together, the democratic legitimacy of school boards. There's something great about kids in a neighborhood going to a school together. So in general, I think that America has developed over 150 years a system of hyper-localized delivery of schools, as opposed to some European countries or other places where you might have like this central national government controlling schools. We have 50 states and then 13,500 school districts. Let me repeat that for your listeners who are still listening. We have more than 13,000 school districts in America. The average school district has about 7 schools. So these are really, really small, not like New York City that has 1,000 schools. Most school districts are quite small. So in general, the system that we have, the non-choice system, has a lot of virtues to it. So the reason why we call it the traditional non-choice system, as many people can figure out, is based on your home address. The district administrators look at a map, say, oh, you live at 123 Main Street. They look at a map and say, oh, you're going to go to Kennedy Elementary School. Now, the reason why I give this long wind-up is, myself included, but lots of people on the right have long criticized this as a monopoly system, an exclusive territorial franchise, a government monopoly, and philosophically, we would be opposed to it. But it turns out that if you look, going back in public opinion surveys, not just over years, but over more than a decade, in general, about 2/3, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, 2/3 about of citizens and families rate their local public schools as either an A or a B on an A through F schedule. Now, if you ask them, what do you think about America's schools in general, they give a much lower grade. They think America's schools might be, going down, but they love their local public schools. So anytime conservatives have been pushing hard for a system of school choice, it always ran headlong into the fact that 2/3 of people actually like their local school system. So that's the defense of the traditional system. The other side, and I am a huge school choice advocate, I've been zealous about this for much of my career, is that there are lots of schools that are not working for lots of kids. And just because 2/3 of families might like their schools, that doesn't mean that everybody does. And in fact, lots of kids of color and lots of low-income kids are assigned to schools that just have not been working, often have been unsafe, and spending a whole lot of money. And just because that family doesn't have money to go to a private school or move somewhere else doesn't, in my view, say, well, it's okay, we can tell them forever, your schools will eventually get better. No, this is like a justice issue. Those families should have some sort of other option available to them. So we have this, choice mechanism, starting with charter schools and then vouchers and tax credits and education savings accounts, trying more and more to simultaneously have a traditional public system that lots of people like and give some number of families, especially low-income families, the ability to choose something else, whether it's a private parochial school, whether it's a home school, whether it's a charter school, something else. So a lot of people think that this is unintelligible, the system that we have, that like a mix of choice and non-choice, but it seems highly evolved to me. Different people can choose different things, different policies trying to meet all these different markers. So this is the long wind up to say, we are seeing right now all families have to navigate a decentralized system and a system that they had relied on not being there. So in 6 months from now, are they going to say, I still love my traditional system? Or are they going to say, I really liked having this homeschooling option? They might say, having this homeschooling option was crazy. It was just way too much for us. Thank goodness we had the traditional public option. We don't know how this thing is going to end up shaking out, especially on like different geographies and income areas. But what we do know is that families generally have liked their traditional public schools, and that these choice options have been growing. There are a couple million kids in charters, a couple million in homeschools. This is all pre-pandemic. Generally, 10% of the population of students has been in some type of private school. But in general, somewhere around 85, 90% of kids are in traditional public schools, and the majority of them have been in assigned schools. Now, a year from now, is that dramatically going to change once we have the chance to go back to normal? I doubt it, but to be determined. We'll see.
Speaking of urban schools, lower performing schools, I'm going to kind of bring it home a little bit here to talk about Kirwan a little bit, the Kirwan Commission recommendations. For those of you who don't know, the Kirwan Commission recommendations, a very controversial, very expensive plan here in Maryland to try to improve public education. There's a lot of different ways to go with this. I know that I'm of the opinion that a lot of what we're seeing here is nothing new under the sun, and now we can't afford it now. We certainly could even afford it before, but now after the pandemic economy, as you talked about earlier, we just simply cannot afford it. You obviously have a unique perspective, having been president of the State Board of Education. What are your thoughts on Kirwan, and would it in fact improve public education in the state if by some chance we can afford it?
Okay, just a little background for your listeners. In general, states have funding formulas that decide how much state money is going to go to local districts and local schools. About every decade, it seems, most states go back and take a look at their funding formula and decide, does the state need to contribute more to some areas, less to other areas, give more for certain types of students? Do we need to require districts to provide more money? It's just an exercise that's ongoing. And as a lot of people will point out, this ratchet only goes one way. School funding always goes up whether or not the results are getting any better or not. We can leave that to the side for a second. So we had the Thornton Commission 15, 20 years ago, which was the first iteration probably in your and my professional careers, where the state of Maryland decided it needed to have a blue ribbon commission to think anew about funding. And so Thornton came out with this commission report that said spend a whole lot more money. The state put a whole lot more money into the system, and the results didn't get all that much better. So then fast forward about 10 years, the state government says we're going to have a new commission. And Britt Kirwan, who had been the chancellor and president of the University of Maryland, chancellor of the University of Maryland system, was the chair of it. A big blue ribbon commission, mostly establishment type players who were on it, school districts, state officials, some state legislators. And so their charge was figure out a new funding formula. But at the same time, there had been enough people who were chastened by the Thornton Commission, essentially saying, we put a whole lot of money into the system last time around. And for example, Baltimore City is still in dire straits, and it doesn't look like our results are all that much better. In fact, Maryland's test scores vis-a-vis other states fell. Are we just going to spend more money and not get any results out of it? So that's the background. So Kirwan comes out with this report, and of course, to no one's surprise, they recommend a whole lot more money into the system. But they also recommended a set of policy changes, some of which I agree with, like an increased focus on career and technical education, some things related to teacher professional development and teacher training that are good. There are some other high ticket items, high dollar items like early childhood education that I have some questions about. But the big shortcoming in my view is it did way too little on the hard stuff, like accountability, and did nothing on school choice. Now, Massachusetts, which did the best example of this, 25, almost 30 years ago, they decided that they were going to do more funding and choice and accountability, and it really set them up to do quite well. Maryland Checkerfin, who was one of the members of the commission, wrote a dissenting opinion at the end of the commission report, essentially raising all of his concerns, and this was one of them, that there's no school choice in this at all. Like the word charter, I don't like appears in the entire report once, and like voucher tax credit, that stuff doesn't appear at all. So there's going to be more money if this thing gets funded, which could do some good, and some school systems will like it. There will be some new programs. I just think that there were too many institutional players on the commission for them to really take on some of the tough questions. So if it got fully funded, would it do good? Probably some good, and in some discrete areas like career technical education, probably do more good. Whether it would be revolutionary, I don't think so. But some of this is like a moot point at this time, because it doesn't look like it's going to get funded this year, maybe not next year, and who knows when it would get funded. And then the question we have to grapple with is, do we do the policy reforms without the money? And there will be big fights about that. But if anyone was like sort of wondering what's the deal with Kirwan, just you can set your clock by it. Every 10 years, the state will think about putting in a whole lot more money into the school system. They will come up with a new formula. And then the question is, does the money actually come, and what reforms on the policy level go hand in hand with it?
One last question before I get you out of here. We've obviously covered a lot of ground today as it relates to, virtual schooling, computers, technology, charters, etc. How does the pandemic, the reaction to the pandemic, and the schooling that has taken place during the pandemic, how does that change public education 5-10 years down the road? I mean, I'm sure it's too early to say, but if you've got your crystal ball, where do you think we're going based on what we've seen change in our public schools since the pandemic started?
What I always do when there's a question like this, and it's not just about the pandemic, is most people have the tendency to overestimate the effects of some sort of intervention, some sort of change like this. And there's something infamous called, the hockey stick graph, where someone always assumes that like things are like going to just go along normally, and then suddenly there's going to be a spike in change because of one change in the environment and policy or whatever. So what I generally am in the position of doing is telling people, always ratchet down your expectations for how much change is going to happen because of this exogenous force that happened. And I think the same thing is generally true about the pandemic. We're going to get through this eventually. Hopefully we get a vaccine. Hopefully schools get back to normal. I do not think that we're going to see the end of traditional public education, residential-based school districts, kids going 20, 25 kids in a classroom, kids and adults engaged face-to-face in the stuff of learning. I think fundamentally that is going to be the same. What I think we're going to likely see more of is this trend, and the reason why I brought up the hockey stick thing is it's not as though there had been no changes in choice and differentiation prior to the pandemic. From about 1850 to about 1990, virtually all kids who were in public schools were in residentially based school districts, these government monopolies. But once we got charter schools in 1991 and vouchers about the exact same time, first in Minnesota and Milwaukee, then they started expanding to other places. Then we started seeing tax credit programs and education savings accounts and charter-like programs, these sort of like hybrid contract type schools. Then we saw more inter-district choice and intra-district choice. And then more families started doing homeschooling. And then there were all these online options. Probably a bunch of your listeners, like their eyes are glazing over. But what I'm saying is, if people looked at today, even like pre-pandemic American public education, and then like if they had come forward from like 1989, they would say, my heavens, like the 1989 American wouldn't have recognized the 2019 American education system. It was so much more pluralistic. It was so much more differentiated. There was so much more choice involved in it. I think that those trends are going to continue, and maybe the pandemic accelerates some of them, like more online learning for high school students or for tutoring, maybe more affection for micro schools, maybe more affection for charter schooling or some private school options. I don't think it'll be dramatic, the difference, but I think these trends in the differentiation of schools and choice will continue and maybe grow a bit. So don't expect like a hockey stick type change. Expect like, if whatever the slope of the line is, expect, a 25% increase in the slope of the line if, the x-axis is something like differentiation.
Andy Smarick is one of the leading conservative thinkers and pundits when it comes to public education. He is on Twitter at Smarick. He writes for the Bulwark. Where else are you writing at these days?
City Journal, The Dispatch, pretty much anyone who's willing to publish my mad ramblings.
Andy Smarick, thanks for joining us in this inaugural episode.
It's fantastic. Thanks for having me, and congratulations.
Thanks a lot. Many thanks to Andy Smarick for joining me on this week's edition of the Duckpin Podcast. Be sure to check out his work over at the Manhattan Institute. Please subscribe to this podcast if you like what you've seen here today or what you heard here today. Subscribe on YouTube. Subscribe on any of the podcasting apps that you may be a part of. We are on all of them. Feel free to reach out to us, theduckpin@gmail.com. And please check out everything that we're doing over on our website, theduckpin.com. Also, be sure to follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at The Duckpin. Please tell your friends and family about this podcast, and please tell your friends and family about The Duckpin. We've got a lot of great stuff coming up here in the next few weeks, and we want you to be a part of it. For everybody at The Duckpin, thank you very much for watching the inaugural Duckpin Podcast. I am Brian Griffiths. Good night.